Okay, we are live. Hello and welcome everyone who has tuned in for this live stream consulting session. This is the seventh session we've done so far. We have Ben with us, who you might also know from one of the people to know content we've published on this channel. We have Radhika, who is building EcoTextura, and she has an amazing set of experiences and background, and she'll all tell about it. But I had the pleasure of finding out a few moments ago. And we have Stephen today with us, who has the expertise in the legal and IP side of things. And I think that those are very fascinating topics, especially intellectual property in the age of all this digitalization going on. I think it's incredibly important and very complex. So his expertise will be very welcome. Just a few words about the format, and then I'll get out of the way because this is a conversation between the three of you. Um, so I, I I would like to just touch quickly on what Radhika is building, and she's gonna talk about that in detail. But I think this is particularly interesting because her current priorities are around the manufacturing of PP products and bringing them into the medical market, and this covers the manufacturing of the prototypes for the trusted supplier, assessing the manufacturing and economic feasibility, when and how to gain medical certifications and approvals, IP and legal strategy, and the customers to work with in private NHS government contracts and all of those. So I don't think we might be able to touch on all of those topics today, but I think talking about a good chunk of them would be valuable. And given Ben has had an experience working with the NHS, I thought he would be a good fit for this session as well. So that's it. If you'd like to check out the other content that we've created so far, feel free to take a look at the Startups of London channel. And it's over to you guys. I would love to perhaps suggest Radhika to maybe recap her experience and tell about the business and current priorities. And then Ben and Stephen can co-lead the session with their questions and perhaps answering Radhika's questions as well. Hope this is very useful to you all.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, firstly, thank you so much, Ozzy, for organising all of this with Startups of London. I'm sure it'll be a very, very insightful and helpful session for me, especially being a startup. I could use the advice. So thank you. So a bit about EcoTextura and myself. EcoTextura is a sustainable PPE supplier. We've been designing our own PPE for so many years now. My background is actually in mechanical engineering, and more specifically, and you might not believe this, but more specifically, eco-friendly and sustainable non-woven fabrics to be used in the medical industry. And I've been doing this since 2015, 16, so far prior to the pandemic. However, EcoTextura we set up at the end of last year, and we were in the R&D stage of producing our own sustainable non-woven fabrics, for example, the types that can be used in gowns or surgical gowns for doctors, even in bibs or hair nets or shoe covers, anything non-woven in the medical industry, we were essentially designing our materials and products for. So we were scheduled to do this for the next 2 years and slowly started, we were expected to slowly start releasing our products. However, we were hit with a pandemic, and a lot of our suppliers switched to from working with us and from helping us to develop our own products to producing existing PPE, just because there was a massive demand for it, a massive need for it. And this was something that we had to overcome this past year. Essentially, what our products do, which are in theory a lot more different to the PPE that currently exists, is our products are made from more sustainable and naturally sourced fibers and materials. And these products, these materials then make PPE products that can be used, sterilized, and disposed of via recycling or industrial composting facilities. So we really do consider the circular economy, as opposed to the types of masks and the KN95 masks that we have now that need to be incinerated due to hygiene reasons. So that's essentially our USP, and we've had to face a lot of pushback with regards to NHS systems and NHS waste disposal systems that we've had to research and kind of see, okay, where can our new products fit in? And alongside that, just a quick recap of what we've done this year. When the pandemic first came out and lockdown was imminent, we started up a charity wing to our company, which we basically made 1,300 reusable face masks for free, and we distributed these to local elderly volunteers, people that were in need in care homes, and from there we started gaining a lot more traction with local councils and local medical centers that said, oh hey, you seem to know a lot, you're locally sourced, can you help us source XYZ types of PPE, nitrile gloves, surgical gowns, patient gowns, face masks, 3-ply face masks, etc. So we've been trading existing PPE whilst making and doing the R&D for our own PPE alongside. So that's kind of what we've been up to right now. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you think.
Wow, great stuff. Yeah, so as Ozzy mentioned, I was working in the NHS for a few months earlier this year in COVID-19 stuff. So I guess one of the reasons that he invited me onto this is because I've had a little bit of contact with MHRA and the derogation process from a software point of view. So I guess I would start with asking, what would you say your biggest challenge is at the moment? You've mentioned quite a few kind of things that could potentially feed into causing you problems, like suppliers switching their focus and things like that. So what's the big thing that why are we here essentially?
Yeah, great question. So I think the biggest barrier to entry it's two-pronged. So one from the consumer's end and one from the supplier end, for sure. So barrier to entry on the supplier end is that suppliers are going to be making existing PPE products right now. They don't have to change their machinery. They don't have to change their techniques of working or retrain their employees to be producing something else. They don't need to invest money into R&D. So there's a barrier to entry there. And we've tried to overcome this by working with smaller facilities that have smaller projects that they're currently working on and can afford to take on new projects. And I think we'll try and expand through that, but there is still a lot of resistance there. And then finally, from the NHS and medical side, from our consumers, the NHS is quite a tricky, big system to crack. There are so many different hoops that you have to jump through, many different layers to it. So you can, we've been talking to some procurement heads in trust, but then also we need to talk to CCGs. And in addition to that, they've requested us to go through the NHS supply chain. So there's many different layers of people to be talking to and of different approvals that you need to get to be able to finally supply into the NHS supply chain. But we're hoping with things being a bit more, we're a bit more desperate now to get a lot more of these products into the market. We're hoping that this process on the consumer end will be expedited somewhat. And I think the main problem that I'm facing at the moment is to try and juggle both of these things and to get to a stage where my business is a bit more scalable, given everything going on. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity to be had, but a lot of organization that needs to go into this to make the most of it. Yeah.
That makes sense. So, I mean, Stephen, feel free to jump in at any point, but my initial observation of what you just said is that you have two sets of customers. One is the small kind of maybe slightly more open-minded one, and then there's the NHS, which is under an awful lot of, some may say, existential pressure in the current climate. Now, sometimes that kind of pressure, you know, we have lots of people in the government talking about the Dunkirk spirit, and that's the way pressure can go sometimes. Unfortunately, I feel like the NHS is probably going to go in the other way, which is that people feel threatened and bureaucracy gets worse. So I think my gut feel from what you just said is that, but based on where your kind of position is now as a new product and everything else, is I would chase the easier, you know, I wouldn't try and climb that massive, great big fence in front of you. I would try and chase the easier people to work with now, and then build the scale as you kind of mature and as your product matures, and therefore you can go into it with all this kind of extra experience. That would be my kind of take.
Perhaps to target a few more private facilities that have the power to implement changes relatively quickly and to procure products relatively quickly and test things on site a lot more quickly as well.
Yeah, and also, I mean, you know, you mentioned the fitting into the existing supply chain and also the disposal chain within the NHS. I mean, that is not that's not something that you're going to crack if you've got a different way of disposing of your products. Something that, you know, something the size of the NHS that has all of this kind of sunk cost into their existing disposal. A friend of mine actually works in a company that supplies disposal stuff to the NHS, and you know, the bureaucracy isn't any better on the way out than it is on the way in, unfortunately. So I think that probably compounds what I would have said. Stephen, you got any thoughts on that? Have you worked with any big companies on this kind of thing?
Yeah, it's actually more my experiences have been acting for businesses some of whom have pivoted and have got into providing PPE or face coverings or hand sanitizer products. And they've had a lot of traction by sort of attacking the sort of lower hanging fruit that you were mentioning, rather than a body like the NHS, which is, I imagine, is a breaking point for lots of different senses from a procurement perspective. And those people that I've spoken to have had a lot more traction with those smaller private companies targeting consumers, but specifically being very, very clear about what they're actually advertising. So if it's not PPE, it's just face coverings. If it's hand sanitizer, what are the properties of that, and being very clear about it. So that could be a quicker, more effective route to market and gaining some of that traction. So I think your observations, Ben, were spot on in that regard.
No, that I think maybe to some extent we have vaguely done that, because at the start of lockdown, we identified there was actually quite a big need for masks that were suitable for lip reading, so clear panel masks. I have some examples here actually, and you can probably see them on my website as well, on EcoTextura.com. It's good to mention we also have an e-commerce branch, and we decided to have this just to have our masks be a bit more accessible, and also because we get great feedback and we feed this back to the factories that we work with, and it's brilliant. You can see the website right here. And this was quite a big problem at the start of the pandemic. A lot of users, I think there's about 11 million people in the UK alone that are deaf and hard of hearing. So they require masks that have a clear panel, because you express a lot of what you say through sign language with your lips. And we identified that there was a big need for this. So we had the resources, the knowledge, and the manufacturers to be making our own masks, as you can see here. And from there, we actually we were approached by some NHS trusts who then asked, listen, there's a pandemic, we are very strict on infection control. Is there a disposable version that we can be making right now? So yes, whilst we were doing all the R&D for our more long-term products and non-woven fabrics, we've also been making these disposable lip reading masks, which can be used in the which are currently going through the approval stages and being used in some NHS trusts at the moment. So for us, this was our low-hanging fruit. This product didn't even exist a few months ago, and for the past 5-6 months we've been working on producing these, which now we're in talks with about 7 or 8 trusts with. to kind of get these rolled out. So operations like this is fantastic for firstly gaining contacts within the NHS, product development, creating tighter bonds with our manufacturing facilities, and also actually it's been producing a lot of cash for us, which we can then later invest into our long-term R&D projects. And of course, with the IP that's associated with our long-term R&D projects as well. I know gaining IP is incredibly expensive, and I do think we have something quite special with the non-wovens that we're planning to make later on. So it's worth considering all of that right now. I think everything's happening at the same time, and I think there might be a bit more organization needed to maximize our output.
Sure, and obviously I'm happy to give you a little bit more background on the IP if you like to go into that, because I think there are a number of different angles that you need to think about when you're talking about protecting your designs. Firstly, I suppose there's the point of you want to make sure that you're not inadvertently infringing anyone else's rights. So that may be patent rights if someone has applied to patent a particular mask which has certain properties and a certain effect, or it could be registered or unregistered design rights as well. So getting a better idea of what the marketplace is like, and I'm sure that you, through your own diligence, you have a decent sense of what's out there. That's, I think, the first thing to do. And what I've done for a lot of my clients is assist in performing freedom to operate searches, essentially in connection with patents and registered design. So seeing what the landscape is like, there are some freely available sources online on the government's Intellectual Property Office website, where you can, for example, get a feel for what patent rights are out there and what registered design rights are out there. But it's useful to have a steer through these things just to make sure that there isn't an issue. And then if you're confident you've come up with something that's genuinely new and innovative, you can look at potentially patent protection or registered design protection yourself. I should also mention that when you're talking about designs themselves, there are unregistered design rights that subsist automatically. So, which is great news, because it means you don't have to do anything in terms of filing fees or anything like that. So, for example, there's a European-wide right which gives you automatic protection in the designs that you create for a period of up to 3 years. And so if you can demonstrate that someone has copied your design, then you can potentially take action against them and protect it. So that right really came into force to try and protect sort of fashion and the fashion industry. So that's something that you potentially have already. And in things like design drawings you create may be protected by copyright as well. Again, that arises automatically. You don't need to do anything, although it is sensible to keep a good log of the designs that you're creating. Then when you're looking at registered protection, the advantage of registered protection is that it can give you a monopoly right. So with a patent, it could give you up to 20 years worth of monopoly right, and that protects what the mask actually does. So if there are any properties in it which create an unusual benefit. And then there's the designs themselves, so the appearance of it. And from what you were showing me there seemed to be some quite interesting aspects in terms of the appearance of how it would look. So you could file a design application, for example, showing a number of different views, maybe 7 different views of the design. And if you can file that and potentially have protection for up to 25 years, and then when you're talking about growing the business, you can think about, okay, well, I've now got an asset which will be interesting for investors, even if it's at the application stage. And then also potentially licensing those intellectual properties out for all sorts of different aspects. And it helps to develop and grow the business, generate a royalty stream and so on. And I'm happy to go into any of that in more detail.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. Actually, it would be interesting to know what kind of cost range something like that for a registered design, for something quite simple as non-woven fabric, what the timescale for something like that is, and also the expected cost range. For what pay?
So for something like a registered design, the good news is that they are quick and relatively inexpensive to register. So it can maybe under £100 to get an application in and register. And it also, the process is quick. The Intellectual Property Office has a bit of a backlog at the moment, but it normally takes maybe a couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks to get something registered. That's because they don't go through as rigorous a process as, for example, the patent side of things, where it tends to be a lot more expensive, thousands of pounds upwards, rather than and can take maybe up to 18 months for the patent even to get through to a formal examination and publication stage. So there is an advantage in the inexpensive to register, relatively speaking, which can be useful for early stage businesses. And it can provide protection. Then they're not as powerful as a patent, because if you create something which has a different overall impression, that would fall out the scope of your monopoly. Whereas if you fall within a claim of a patent where you set out your scope of monopoly, you potentially take things forward in terms of infringement. But they are, of the intellectual property rights, that they are probably the least expensive to register and maintain.
Right, I see. Another question on this is, at what stage do you start to approach this? We have prototypes made for our new non-woven fabrics from the last few months. We just got a recent batch of prototypes made. Whilst we have a few more, I think a few more iterations to go till this is perfected. We also have to look into getting EN and ISO testing done on it too. So at what point do we look to register everything, or is that just going to have to be the final step, or is it something that you can do alongside doing all your additional tests, EN and ISO tests?
So I think it's worth thinking about IP, and I probably would say this from as early stage as you possibly can do, because I would say once you've got to a stage where your designs, and they don't necessarily have to be made, they can just be drawings, and normally they're filed as line drawings. Once you've got them to a stage where they're in a more or less finalized form, then it's the time to think about it. I should also mention a couple other things that I think are relevant to this. First of all, you can get up to a year's grace period for when you first put a product on the market to actually go and register the design. So you have 12 months when that's deliberately designed for businesses like yourself, so they can test the water, see if the product's going to be successful before then registering it. Second point to mention is that registered designs won't protect functional aspects, so the things that are our essential technical bits, wrap around, etc., the things that make the mask fit. But it will protect the look and feel and the overall appearance. So when it comes down to filing designs, it's normally best to get a line drawing done where you disclaim things that are functional that you can't really protect, and claim aspects that are protectable. So you should be thinking about it as an early possible stage. It's particularly just stepping towards the patent side of things again. If you think that you might have something that's patentable, i.e. that there are properties or aspects of the marks which could be protected in a more functional way, then they have very rigorous and strict novelty rights. So as soon as you make it available, then you can't patent it. Designs, it's a bit more lenient. So that's why it's important at the early stages, when you think you've come up with an innovative concept, keep it under NDA, have confidentiality agreements. And also, I should say, just as aside from the designs, I saw that you obviously have your name on there. That's a trademark protection is another thing that you need to think about at an early stage, to the extent you haven't already, protecting the name, protecting any key logos in relation to the goods and services that you're supplying. So that's something else to think about.
I see. And would you say that's actually a very important thing for startups to be considering at this point? Should it be alongside the rest of their operations and everything else as well? Because I mean, I'm sure you can understand, for a startup, my priorities are making sure the customers are there, the market is hungry for my products, making sure my products are the correct design, and also just getting my products out there as quick as possible. This falls quite low down. So in your opinion, how important do you think this is?
I think it is important, but I think you need to balance things out and approach things in a very sensible way. So, for example, you don't need to apply to register trademarks for everything under the sun in every single class of goods and services. You don't have to, you should, in terms of the designs and things that you might want to protect, you need to look at it. Which do I think are my most valuable designs? Where do I think I'm getting traction? With trademarks, it is important because you don't want to be in a situation where you potentially have to change your brand name because it turns out that someone has applied for and registered the mark earlier in relation to food-assembly goods. And if you haven't necessarily built up any earlier goodwill or unregistered rights, you may have to rebrand, which is a painful process. And trademarks can be useful for doing things like controlling your supply chain. So, for example, you can license your mark out to third parties to be able to maybe sell or distribute, but you can also say, for that, we want you to behave and we don't want you to be selling these products for hugely inflated prices. And you can factor that in a trademark context. So if someone is doing that, then that could damage your trademark, you could argue, and then you can stop those sort of behaviors. So that it can be a useful tool. So in terms of priorities, I would say get the word applied for and covering your key goods and services. And logos. That's what I typically, a key logo. That's what I typically say to startups. If you have to pick one, it should be the word. But obviously, you need to have balance that budget against all these other competing cost pressures that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's given me a lot to think about. Alongside that, I noticed you mentioned NDAs. I think the best way to get a product out to market is using the lean startup model, the lean business model, where you make products, you develop them, you make as many iterations as possible and get them checked by a panel or some consumers as quick as possible, and you keep going back and forth until you're refined to the best stage. Luckily, our products are very simple in that sense, so we can do that. We can afford to do that. This has been the product of I'd say about 7 or 8 or 9 different iterations, and we have sent these off to some NHS trusts that we have worked with. However, we've had some pushback with them regarding signing NDAs, for example. So they said, no, we can't do that. We can't have this agreement set up with you for XYZ reasons. But us being the small player in the game, we kind of just have to go with it, and we have to just take that risk and send out our prototypes to them for feedback as much as we can. I don't know what your viewpoint is there, or if there's anything that we should look out for, if we can still carry on this way, or if there's minimum risk. It would be interesting to know, because this is the only way we see our products developing quite quickly and entering the market quite quickly, but we do take on that risk.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I would say if there is something that is which you would regard as a trade secret, which is the special sauce behind what you're doing, or a particularly valuable design that you don't want to get out there, then I would expect, in the vast majority of circumstances, in terms of my experience anyway, that people are respectful of that, and that they will be happy to sign NDAs, provided that they're reasonably drafted and don't impose ridiculous obligations. Now, if you're getting to a situation where people are refusing to do that, and that's for legitimate reasons, then you have to make a decision about whether you think it's worth sharing that information. As it won't necessarily prejudice necessarily a registered design application, but it would certainly prejudice you from trying to achieve patent protection. And you have to weigh these things up. I would typically say, though, if we're talking about things like, and I appreciate it's not necessarily PPE, but valuable code or know-how, that sort of thing, you should be insisting people enter into NDAs. And if they're not willing to do that, to my mind, that usually raises a bit of a red flag, unless there's a really strong objective justification for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been surprised. It's actually been a few procurement heads and people that work in NHS trusts who don't want to get involved in signing any NDAs with private companies. But
I would suggest that that's probably because it's somebody else's job and they're scared of overstepping their own authority. Yeah, that's what I suspect is happening there. It's you know, the my experience of different parts of the NHS. There are some parts that aren't like this, but you know, when you have medical and legal overlapping, people tend to get really nervous about overstepping their boundary. So yeah, I would suspect that that's what's happening. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. I've been sort of listening in. You were asking about priorities and you know, the lean startup model. So there's a natural kind of evolution of products, not just physical products, but you know, software and all types of products that goes from the kind of the genesis phase through to a commodity, and it's a, you know, things make that journey or they die out along the way, tends to happen. So I would maybe ask you mentioned about the non-woven fabric that was your that was, you know, part of what you did your degree on and what you've done your study on. I would maybe think about splitting out the, you know, very fast moving iterative design phase from, you know, as James called it, the secret sauce. Like, what's the, you know, if you have a mask product that doesn't go well, you know, you spent a few £100 or a few £1,000s on developing it, but no biggie. But if you've got your thing that is your, you know, your fundamental advantage, that's the bit that you need to be more strategic with and think about not only what it's worth now, but what does it look like when that has moved across this kind of evolutionary process and you've built other things on top of it. That's when you need to start thinking about, oh, well, you know, I might not get to market with this in 6 months because people won't sign an NDA, but I might be pessimizing my opportunities, you know, a year, 2, 5 down the line.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So essentially, marking the different products as short, mid, long, long term, and seeing maybe if I could leverage progress in some with others. So with, for example, the disposable lip reading mask that we have here, hopefully that can be a gateway to a lot of medical centers, and then from then on they can help us work on our long-term products going forwards. So I think essentially, I think I will continue to, you know, adapt the low-hanging fruit, these sorts of products, and you know, pave the way for more long-term products that we have, which should hopefully revolutionize the you know, PPE industry for the NHS and other medical centres across the UK, and hopefully the world. But yeah, there's a lot to think about.
Sorry, just to maybe wasn't quite as clear as I could have been there. It's not just necessarily the individual products, but it's also the components of the products, right? So when you think about a product as a whole, and you reason about what that might look like in the market, well, there's all the bits that go into it. So what I was getting at was, you know, your secret sauce of, you know, the special type of fabric or a manufacturing technique or whatever. You could consider those separately from the products that you actually go and sell, and you can decide what levels of protection you require for those things. And, you know, and then all of Stephen's stuff about NDAs and IP protection and all that kind of thing comes in there, because you could potentially be, you know, in order to manage your priorities and you know, your overhead of just operating in an early stage business, you can be a bit more intentional about the small, very fundamental bits that are the kind of critical factors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that really does. And I guess another question that I had was, how could I possibly leverage or harness technology and programming to accelerate the business, or make it a bit more scalable, or help with marketing things, or, you know, essentially we just want to get to a stage where we want larger contracts, products which have been tested and approved by large bodies, and we have large contracts in place. So how could I possibly use technology and leverage that to help us grow?
Oh, that is a big question, isn't it? So I really like what you've just described, what you're doing with like the direct to consumer stuff is your lean startup. That's your kind of, I think of things like this as there's a concept that I always talk about called the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. And what that essentially means is that you have, the boundary of your organization with the outside world is your sense making mechanism, right? And this is your, fast moving, direct to consumer. People like this, they don't like that. They buy lots of this, they don't buy that. They buy this type of thing in this place, they buy that type of thing in another place. But the problem is that when you're flipping that over to, getting bigger contracts with bigger companies, you kind of lose that agility and that flexibility, right? Because you're now working to other people's tempo. You're now working to the tempo of people that won't sign an NDA because they are scared that they'll get fired for it, that kind of thing. And that, unfortunately, I think is more of a people problem than a technology problem, potentially, because you're dependent on how the organizations that you're selling to do their thing.
Yeah.
I don't know, Stephen, have you got anything that you'd add to that?
No, I think that's probably about right. I think when you're dealing with the smaller businesses or smaller consumers, it can actually be a lot easier because you're dealing with people who just want to get on and do business, and they will be more accustomed to seeing certain types of legal documents for sure, and entering into those sorts of obligations. Whereas you sometimes, if you're getting into a bigger institution, you'll be passed from department to department. They'll have their processes, their red tape, etc., and that can become a bit more frustrating. So I recognise quite a few of the things that you were saying there, Ben.
Yeah, and in the NHS, you don't measure frustration by how many departments you get passed to. You measure it by how many departments you get passed back to, and you go round and round and round.
It really does seem that that's the case at the moment. But I'm just hoping that the NHS surprisingly have actually brought in a lot of new products, mainly from the States, that are all FDA certified and approved. And they've expedited the adoption process into the NHS here. Primarily because of the pandemic, because there's a huge need for these new specialist types of PPE. So we're just hoping that we can ride this wave and, maximize the chances of that happening for our products as well. And yeah, for us, it is really a case of getting contact with a lot of trust, make sure we keep putting our new changes and feedback into our product, and churning out new prototypes and getting these tested and approved quicker and quicker each time, and then using the cash for all of this to invest into our long-term non-woven fabric developments that we can be using in our products in the future. There's a lot to consider, from the technology, consumer management, supplier management, and IP side to all of this. But it's fantastic to see that for the products we have made and put out there, the orders are coming in, feedback is good, and we can keep going. So let's see how things go.
Just one thing that came to mind while you were talking there. So you're talking with lots of trusts. I wonder if there's an approach where you could find common ground with other suppliers that are also doing this, because I'm assuming that there'll probably be a lot of small players like you and other people making PPE or not just PPE but other things that are all fighting this battle individually. And when I say battle, that's the wrong framing. It's they are all trying to figure out how to make the world a better place by supplying their products to the NHS individually. I wonder if it's worth looking for cooperatives or some means of banding together so that you're not all doing all of that work at the same time. I don't know if there's anything like that exists in your industry.
Yeah, I think the thing that kind of connects all of these trusts together is the NHS supply chain. So if a procurement head in the trust for Harrogate, for example, the Harrogate Trust wants to order X amount of 3-ply masks, which are type 2 rated, etc., they will go to the NHS supply chain, which has a catalogue of all the registered suppliers on there, and they can just order as much as they want. Otherwise, each NHS trust, the head of procurement has the power to go out to private companies themselves and make individual orders, as long as the order doesn't exceed the amount of 7,500, I believe, because after that, it has to go into the tendering process. So there's a few loopholes like that. There's a few barriers with the NHS like that. However, when I approached the NHS supply chain, and I've been in contact with them quite frequently over the last few months, they've been inundated with requests for suppliers from across the country, from across Europe, across the world, to be supplying their PPE to them, to the point that they've said, nope, no more. But hopefully we can show them that we have a few more specialized products which are in need, which are different from your usual 3-ply mask that everyone can get hold of. So yeah, the body that we're really trying to hack right now, I'd say, is the NHS supply chain, because that's connected to absolutely everything. So if you have a good product, if you have a reputable company, if you have the good contacts, then that's the way to go, and that'll be very effective.
Or if you don't have any products and no company, but you have the right politician in your pocket, that's also one way you could look at.
Unfortunately, that is also the case. But I don't know if we're that lucky.
Unfortunately, we don't have a consultant for that, so perhaps we do. I don't know. I don't know any, at least. Let me jump in here. I think this was a informative chat from what I could see from the comments and other people who have tuned in. So Ben, Stephen, thank you very much for your contributions. I have thoroughly enjoyed listening to them. And Radhika, was it useful to you?
Incredibly useful. I have a whole page of notes and a lot to think about walking away from this session. So I think I will definitely have a big reorg of the next few steps that I need to take as a business to really optimize everything. So no, thank you so much. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Stephen.
That's fantastic to hear. I mean, it was. I'm really glad we had you on. And I wish you the best with. I hope you're incredibly successful, because I feel like you deserve it. There's a new tradition that I started to do. I take note of the important things that were shared in the conversation, so they don't get lost and don't fall through the cracks. So I have 7 of those, and this is just like a very brief and very fast overcap of the key things that we've discussed. So let me just underline those 7 points. First of all, focus on the low-hanging fruits by producing easy to sell and scale products before seeking large deals with NHS or very large partners. Second one is keep a good log of the designs you're creating for copyright. Also, possibly look into register protection for a monopoly right, both in terms of appearance and functionality. This can be an important asset, especially for future investors. And this also paves the way for possibility of licensing. The third one is you can get a years up to a grace period to register the design, and registered designs won't protect the functional aspect, but they will protect the overall look and appearance. And number 4 is what to do when potential partners don't want to sign an NDA. It's a difficult decision and a decision of risk for the founder. Unless there's a strong justification, it might be a red flag in some situations. Number 5, in terms of prioritization, think lean and try to mark products and their components as short, mid, and long term. And it might be good to experiment around these short-term products, but be more strategic about the longer-term products. Number 6 is make use of the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. And in this case, the observation might point out to the fact that the problem might not be a technology problem, but it might be a problem. It might be a people issue in a way when you're dealing with very large organizations such as the NHS. And finally, number 7, I don't think you've discussed this, but this is my contribution to these bullet points. It is very rudimentary, it's very basic, but I think it works wonders, Radhika. So I just wanted to share that with you, is to create a checklist of the key actions and key things to do to get the product into the medical market. And if you have that checklist as a written document that is easy to digest, and once you speak with experts, then this gives you the opportunity to get clear and good feedback on what that checklist might potentially be missing. And so it might actually be then at the second stage easier to order them into a list of priority. It's very rudimentary, I know, but even pilots use it to take off. So why don't we use a checklist? I think that could be really beneficial as well. So those 7 things were the takeaways out of this discussion. And again, thank you very much for coming in today and sharing your expertise. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in to listen. And we'll talk to you in the next episode, next Tuesday, 12 p.m. See you later. Bye-bye.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks. Bye.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ozzy.
Thanks.
Great stuff.